at some point I hit my breaking point where I couldn't shoulder it all and accomplish everything just by, sheer willpower, and something needed to change.
My guest today is Al Lindsay. Al spent nearly 3 decades in tech, including leading a large organization at Amazon with over 1,000 people on the critical path of building and scaling Alexa. In fact, Al was the original engineering leader of Alexa and built the entire science, engineering, and operations team that took Alexa from an idea of Jeff Bezos into something that's used by hundreds of millions of people. He operated at the highest levels, close to the center of decision making in very high pressure, always on environments. And he walked away at the peak of his career. Al and I both worked at Amazon, although I didn't know him well there. And a few years ago, he joined me at Tequity. I knew Al would be a great Zero to Proof guest because of the incredible work he did at Amazon, as well as the decisions he made and what he has chosen to do with his life since then. How he balances his personal interests with his professional interests and integrates those. In this conversation, we talk about that moment, what drives someone to leave when everything looks like it's working from the outside. We get into the reality of operating at scale, the cost of always-on leadership, and what happens when your personal runway starts to matter more than your professional trajectory. Those themes, I think, are important for so many people. I know they resonate with me. We also talk about what comes next, why stepping away is harder than it sounds, how to rebuild a life with intention, and what it looks like to stay engaged without being consumed. This is a conversation about pressure, perspective, and choosing how you want to spend your time when you finally have the ability to choose. Very honored to have Al as a guest.
So Al, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So the idea here, as we've discussed, is to talk to people who've made that life choice. And, you made that choice at Amazon a few years ago. And if you could talk a little bit about what led you to, what we're calling that Zero to Prove moment, where you decided you needed to make a change, to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. And I think for context, the role I was in was leading a large organization, more than 1,000 people, that was on the critical path to creation, invention, and management of the Alexa business. So it was a big role. There were a lot of moving parts. It was highly visible at the highest levels of Amazon. So a lot of scrutiny, close to the sun, as we would say. Very hot, a lot of pressure in that space. And one of the markers of a role like that is it's not a 40 or even a 60-hour-a-week job. It's an always-on job, and always on in the sense that you need to respond quickly to any and all things that are happening either within your team to keep things moving forward, or requests coming from, people like Jeff, question mark emails, the constant flow of issues with having that scale of product in the marketplace when there's problems. So you really don't have boundaries between work and life. And I think this is probably why Jeff marketed his famous work-life synergy phrase as a replacement for work-life balance, because it's not about having them in balance. It's about synergistically having them exist together because they're both always on. And so for me, I think after, almost 30 years in tech, the last 8 years in Alexa at Amazon were probably the most intense. So it's almost like, if there's a curve of intensity and hard work and hours put in and stress and organizational complexity and problem complexity, it really accelerated at the end of my career. And what's interesting about that is at the same time, my own energy curve as I get older, I've got 3 kids, they're all in sports. I'm trying to do everything. And I think at some point I hit my breaking point where I couldn't shoulder it all and accomplish everything just by, sheer willpower, and something needed to change. And so, to your question, like what was it that drove me to that change? I think there are a bunch of factors. One was that, age is a factor. You're kind of looking at your own personal runway, thinking about, what you'll be able to do in each of the decades ahead, physically, mentally, financially, and when you need to start doing some of those things because eventually you can't do them. Looking at, financial opportunity to step away from an operating role like that. Really, I had just arrived at the peak of my income earning part of my career. By all rights, anyone else who's kind of chasing that career dream, they probably want to put 10 more years in at that level, right? To really have the rewards that they hope to. But I left right at the beginning of that quite early because for me, it was more about wanting to take advantage of my remaining runway to tackle many other things that were important to me in life. And then my health was a factor there as well, I think. You know, that curve, those two curves kind of going in opposite directions, sort of me, health, age, and work, stress, complexity of role. I mean, literally led to me leaving the office in an ambulance one day. So that was kind of the turning point, the wake call, which is okay. Do you is this how we want to keep going, or do we want to change something? And so, I'll acknowledge I'm really lucky and blessed, fortunate to be in a situation where I can make a decision to step away from that. And so then that was 7 years ago. And I would say I really floundered for the first couple of years to figure out what's next. There were a mix of hobbies that I thought. So as a high performing executive in high tech, you feel like you can do everything. In a 10-hour day in the office, you crank out so many decisions and so many things move forward and get completed, largely because the team was amazing. But you have that every minute is optimized. Your output is very focused. You're very efficient. And so I figured the first thing I would do is spend 6 to 12 months and just crush all of the things I had at home that had been waiting for my attention, you know, construction projects or renovations or, whatever it was, learn some new skills. And so I tried that. I spent 18 months fully immersed in a massive home project that you're familiar with, the pool house, where
Yeah.
I worked alongside my friend, general contractor, wanting to learn everything, basically how to build a house myself and trying to knock out all of those things that were on my to-do list myself. And I I found that was no different than being back in the leadership role in high tech, where there was no end in sight to the work, and you actually can't crank through it as quickly as you think. And it was less rewarding. This was one of those things that was an interesting discovery, which is it was less rewarding to do what I would call carpentry than I thought it would be. And what I was really missing, I think, was the interaction with a team of really smart, accomplished people solving really interesting problems that make a difference in other people's lives. I was just doing stuff for myself, and it didn't have the same level of fulfillment. So at the same time, in those first 2 years, I was dabbling in trying to advise small companies, startups through my own personal network, maybe do some board work. And I did work with and meet a bunch of interesting people at small companies. But what I found was my background and skill set and the things I had learned at Amazon that were unique lessons to learn at Amazon didn't apply to them. They weren't really having the massive, scale growth, operational excellence, keeping the lights on for 100 million users type problems. They had very, 1.0 problems, very, very simple 0 to 1 problems that I think weren't really a good application of my time. And then, of course, it ended up being uncompensated work at the end of the day. So it was pro bono work for small companies where maybe my time wasn't most effectively or efficiently being applied to either help them, like in a lot of cases, I actually wasn't helpful to them because it wasn't what they needed. They needed something else. So I think it took me a couple of years and meeting you and stumbling across a few sort of medium-sized or larger companies that had some meatier, challenging problems for it to scratch that itch, I guess, like to be, intellectually challenging on a level that made it fun. right? That
Yeah.
gave you an opportunity to dig in a new space and look at an industry you'd never looked at before, but then apply all of your experiences and skills from building software and, in the tech world, and in the end have positive impact for those companies. And so that has been rewarding. I will say the other challenge with, keeping one foot in industry. So it's easy when you have a client and you go in and you help them to not now be drawn into that always on 80 hours a week, can never turn my mind off it. You can easily move back and forth between different priorities in your life and give them the mind share and sleep quite soundly at night, because you don't own it. Someone else owns the execution and delivery and the operation, and you're there as a trusted advisor or helper or co-pilot to get to help them achieve their goals. So that part's great. The challenge is, as is often said about the consulting world, because it is a little bit consulting, these part-time interactions, it's feast or famine. And so sometimes you find yourself working in fits and spurts, I guess I would say, where you've got a concentrated amount of work in a short period of time that does make it hard to do all of those other things that you're trying to do in parallel. But it's way more manageable than
Yeah.
it was in the context of shipping a product at a place like Amazon. So
Yeah, so it's I want to, if you can go back to, cuz the Amazon period and what you talked about the demands as a leader, and cuz I've had people say to me, gosh, which is very similar to what you described, what a great job, why would you ever leave? Couldn't you just say, hey, look, I'm sorry, I'm not available after 7 o'clock at night. I've got family time. I'm off for a few days, and unless you've been in those situations, it's hard to understand. I mean, you described the Jeff emails as a question mark, but I mean, just some anecdotal sense of how you came to realize that the responsibilities that you had made that not an option in that world.
well, I think part of that I put on myself, but I wrote a little bit about this in the short book that I wrote. If
Lessons
you're going
for
to run a
anybody who's interested, Al wrote a book called Lessons from Alexa, which is available on Amazon. So, Al Lindsay.
And the takeaway there on leading large teams that are in a lot of different geographies is you got to spend time frequently enough, face time, visible time with those groups. So one component of it was travel, right? You acquire a company somewhere in Eastern Europe, and then you need to be over there every month, spending time building that into your overall organization and landing it. You can't just, forget about it and assume it's going to be successful. And maybe that's leadership style or my own belief that that's what was required to make it successful. And perhaps it could have been done lighter touch, but I just found myself in the
Yeah.
air a lot, on the road a lot. The operational part of it too, and the ownership model. So if you own Alexa and there's an AWS outage in IAD3 and it takes out your services, and so 100 million devices aren't responding to requests from customers, and
You get the email.
you as the need to be involved. You can't delegate that. You
Yeah.
need to be on the call, helping the team in any way you can to guide them through troubleshooting and getting that service back online. And so you don't get to decide when those events happen. There's a lot of those. I had many Christmases where I wasn't home because on Christmas morning everyone opens up their Alexa devices, Merry Christmas, and then they plug them in and they start playing with them, and this sea of traffic hits our servers, and all the best laid plans to be ready for that ultimately result in hiccups and
Mm.
unexpected surges and need to deploy hardware on the fly in certain areas. And so we put a team together and we're in the office on Christmas Eve and Christmas morning every year to make sure the customers had a good experience. And so my kids waited till noon on Christmas Day, West Coast time, when most of Christmas is done from Europe all the way across the US, so that I was available. So
Yeah.
we could, do Christmas morning. And so those are just some examples of where you really, it's not optional. Those
Yep.
things are what they are, and that's where I think the synergy statement comes from. You have to
Yeah.
want it, though. You have to
You have to
decide that
want it.
that's what the
Yeah.
rewards of that deliverable were worth it, but 8 years is a long time on something like that. I feel my time on, say, Amazon Prime wasn't as close to the sun, if you will. Like,
Then
it wasn't as
yeah, I think the people who haven't been in those situations, and that type of leadership is not limited to tech companies. It comes down to the roles that you have, and as you said, the customers that are dependent on you and the people that are dependent on you. So you have a responsibility, higher than your own personal needs. And as you said, you at that moment in time, you can't have two number one priorities. It's Christmas Day, and in that job, you had to be where you were. And so, but at the same time, as you talked about, there's parts of that that you liked and you wanted to maintain. So, you talked a little bit about in the current world that you're in, what does that synergy look like now?
You mean how am I balancing work
Yeah.
with life in that
Yeah,
in
I'm
that
using
regard?
you. We're avoiding balance because as you described, Jeff's point was synergy. And I think that term makes sense to me as well. I mean, your synergy is different than it was. It is still an integration of different parts of your life. I mean, in your case, you have your family, you have work, you have the hobbies, that you are passionate about. I mean, you play you still never amaze me. You're out there playing hockey, you have you have a sawmill. You do a lot of really interesting things. So that integration and balance is different. And if I can ask, what is how have you designed that, and kind of what have you learned in the process?
One of the things, and this isn't unique to high tech, it's probably just the state of the world today, is that I think most behaviors, especially when you're raising young families and building a career, are sort of they're fraught with context switching, meaning, and leadership at Amazon is very much like this. You walk into a room full of your team members, they prepared a 6-pager for you, you sit down, read for 20 minutes, load it all, have a very deep discussion, guide them, give them some feedback, maybe send them back to the drawing board on a few things, and then an hour later you're doing it again on a completely different topic with a completely different group of people. It's extremely fragmented, and then in between you're responding to your question mark emails from Jeff and everything else that's going on. And maybe if you need to write something, that happens after 9 p.m. because you don't really have concentrated blocks of time where you can put your head down and focus for a period of time. So what's different, I think, between being in those leadership roles marked by constant task switching and where I am now is I can create entire days of concentration where I can go very deep. I can go into my shop and spend an 8-hour day work, like making a piece of furniture, and not be constantly interrupted by, well, I can turn off all the interruptions. I have that luxury now. I didn't have that before. And same with the work. So in so much as it's possible, if I can get it compressed into a part of my week where, like for me, it's Tuesdays.
Yeah.
Tuesday is my work day, right? Say that's my, 20% ante. If I can keep it all in that one period, I can really concentrate deeply on it and then set it aside. And on Wednesday, go and give all my attention to something completely different. And that makes me more effective, I think. I think context switching, though we think that we're multitasking, we are less effective and less efficient when we're doing it than humans are, is my sense. That if you're concentrated on a task for a longer period of time, you're better at it. At least for me, that seems to be the case. And I'm finding that more enjoyable.
Yeah. So how do you then one of the things you mentioned is, although in this case you just talked about Tuesday, you'd like to keep it to Tuesdays, it's not going to stay on Tuesdays. It isn't the level of lack of control that you had before. So,
No.
because it's not what's the hardest part of if you could describe your model a little bit today, because I think you kind of alluded to it, but if you would say, what are the priorities in your life that you're integrating? And how do you think about making that work and what have you learned?
Yeah. So I think I've got family, I've got adult children who are very much part of my life on a daily basis. I've got my high needs hobbies, as you alluded to, the lumber mill. I go from tree to furniture, and there's a lot of steps in between. And I'm still very active, taking classes and learning new skills in that area. I think that's a lifelong learning thing, and so I try to create blocks of time for put myself in the shop for a day. right? Like, in fact, this is what I'm going to do tomorrow. Is go and block off the whole day, and I'll be in the shop building, making things. And I didn't have that luxury before because, I just didn't have control of my schedule at all. But, it's the balance of things. There's my activities. I love to travel, and explore. I've got family all over the place that I like to spend time with. I've got my hobbies. I've got my properties that require my time, effort, maintenance. And I've got my work, which, keeps me kind of focused on what's going on in that space and scratches the mental itch to, you know, learn, keep learning new things, always
Yeah.
be learning.
Yeah, so talk about that a little bit more though, because I think the professional part, in my experience, is the part that people struggle continuing. I mean, spending time with family is in your control for the most part, and, picking the hobbies and the travel, but it's how does the professional part of that fit in? Because you talked a little bit about, staying engaged and challenged and team and relevance. And so what are the tenets of the professional part that in this part of your life?
Tenets. So
Or
to me,
whatever is the right term for you there. Yeah.
right. I'm learning to be more selective because, like I said, in those first couple of years when I was kind of fumbling, trying to find my way, I found myself involved in a number of things that were low value, both for the company and for me. So I want to make sure that my time is used efficiently and applied to things where I can actually help, and because that's my reward back is seeing an impact. If I can apply my patterns of things that I've learned throughout my career to help someone who's struggling with a problem and then see them get over that hump and move past it and have success on some level, that's the type of reward that motivates me, right? So, it's you want to be selective about where you insert yourself to help. And there's a whole different discussion we can have about how you find such opportunities and how difficult that is or impossible. And like working your network is probably a perpetual ongoing thing that you do if you want to stay plugged in some level, constantly reading what's going on in the space. Like right now, AI kind of dominates the news cycles in our world. And so trying to keep abreast who's doing what and how it's affecting businesses, because that's relevant to what might help my clients. These are things that are interesting, relevant, current, and hopefully, if I can help get paired up with and help a company or a leader or a team that's struggling with something in that space and have positive impacts for them, then that's the perfect confluence of things for me. I guess the last thing would be there's a bit of a mission to, and I'm not overly indexing on this, but there's a bit of a mission part of this, which is even all the better if the company you're helping or the team you're helping is doing something that has a positive impact on the world, on society, on people, on one group of people's lives. You know, something that where you feel like what you're doing matters. You're not just generating another $1 million in ad revenue for some
Right.
company, but you're maybe helping to democratize a solution that helps people with a particular disability. Its own reward.
Yeah, I think and I think this right here is the crux for me of this, that when you get for this phase of life to work, you have to find some version of what you described. If you're a person who wants to stay engaged and involved in contributing, there's a there's a book that's coming out the next week or two. A woman wrote a book called Mattering, which, is a version I think, when you talked about it is you wanna contribute, you wanna give, there's a value that comes from making a difference and helping people. You described helping people work on projects that matter, helping teams, lending your expertise in history. You have, you have something that's very unique. Not that many people have gone through the scaling and intensity and performance that you described. I liken this in a lot of ways to, high level professional sports. That once you don't want to do that your whole life, and you can't do that your whole life. But the
Yeah.
lessons that you learned from, and again, I didn't, but when you look at people who put 150% of themselves into competing as part of teams, and you listen to the ones with values that you appreciate. They're not self-centered. It's about the team. It's about making an impact. Those people have great things to offer other people. And I think, one of the things that I really admire about you is, in a sense, that's a big part of your North Star. You want to stay involved. You want to figure out how you can bring the expertise and scars, floggings. Someone told me the other day, to bear in support of other people, but you also want to do it on your own terms. And I think you did a really good job of describing how that works for you. So, no, I just wondered, if there's anything else. I think you said something really important early on, which is, each of us only has a certain amount of time and a certain amount of life energy, and you don't know what that is. But for me, and it sounds like for you as well, there comes a moment where, I want my life energy to be going into things, that I care personally about, and you have described a range of those. So just when you think about your next 10 years, looking back, working backwards from your next 10 years, what are the set of things that you want to feel accomplished might be the wrong word. What do you want this next stage to be?
I've got an actual written down list of things I'd like to accomplish, many of which haven't begun, most of which require me to still have my physical and mental faculties about me. So that's a big part of it is
Yep.
you got to start knocking off those trips, those skills learning. It's interesting how challenging it is now, but even just traveling Latin America and wishing I knew a little more Spanish and then trying to embark upon learning more Spanish, it's really, and there's one more thing to fit into your daily routine that can be
Yeah.
challenging. And then your capacity to learn languages at later in life is lower. It's harder. You got to work harder at it. So, there's a lot of things I'd like to accomplish. I acknowledge that it's the type of list that's not meant to be completed.
Yeah.
It's gonna be way more than can be done. But I hope to look back on the decade and feel healthy and sharp and fulfilled, happy with my life, to look at and see, happy, thriving children, where I've helped them where I can, continue to grow and learn, and to have a list of people, teams, companies that I helped succeed as well, and be able to look back and see the impact they're having on the world, and feel like I had some small part of it, the way I feel when I look back at, my impact at Amazon.
Well, that is a great wrap up. So thank you very much for your time. Thanks for sharing, all your experience and learnings. And again, yeah, thanks.